The story of the Americas did not begin with the arrival of European ships upon its shores, long before the sails of Spain or the banners of England appeared on the horizon. This vast and varied continent was home to civilizations whose histories are etched into its mountains, valleys, forests, and rivers. From the stepped temples of the Maya to the towering citadels of the Inca, from the cliff dwellings of the ancestral Puebloans to the sprawling mound cities of the Mississippians, this was a land shaped by centuries of culture, migration, warfare, and trade. Yet in the shadows of time, the distant hum of ships began to gather. First came whispers from the icy coasts of the far north, as Norse explorers unknowingly opened a fragile passage between two worlds. Then, with growing certainty and purpose, the wave of European expansion crossed the Atlantic. At first it came in fragments, curious navigators, accidental landings, tentative settlements, but it would soon become a tide. The arrival of Christopher Columbus in 1492 signaled the turning point, and with his landing, the slow unraveling of a continent's ancient rhythm had begun. The encounters that followed were not fleeting. They were enduring and transformative. They would set the course for empires to rise, for others to fall, and for the very shape of global history to be forever changed. As the age of exploration gave way to the age of conquest, new names entered the record: Hernán Cortés, Francisco Pizarro, Jacques Cartier, John Smith. With them came gunpowder, steel, and disease, tools of an age that would erase some worlds, reshape others, and leave deep, lasting marks on the land and the people who called it home. But this was only the beginning. The colonization of the Americas would span centuries, and its effects still echo across time. It would give birth to nations, redraw borders, and lay the foundations of the modern world. But before that, it would bring chaos and order, resistance and surrender, hope and despair. And so, to understand how it all came to be, to trace the footsteps from ancient empires to colonial powers, we must continue this journey. From the conquests of Cortés and Pizarro, to the battles for control waged by France, Spain, Portugal, and England, the story of colonization was far from over. First contact, the arrival of Europe. As the 15th century drew to a close, a quiet revolution was underway across Europe. Nations were unifying, trade routes were expanding, and knowledge, spurred by the Renaissance, was reshaping how people viewed the world. At the heart of this transformation stood a single question: what lay beyond the edge of the known map? The answer would come from the last sailors of the North. The Norse voyages. Long before the great powers of Spain or Portugal set their course westward, it was the Norse who first reached the shores of North America. In the late 10th century, Icelandic sagas tell of a man named Eric the Red. Banished from Iceland, he sailed west and discovered a rugged coastline, Greenland. There he established a settlement on the island's southern edge. His son, Leif Erikson, would go further. Around the year 1000, Leif set sail from Greenland, driven by tales of a distant land filled with timber and wild grapes. His ship landed on the coast of what is today Newfoundland, in Canada. They named the land Vinland. There, Norse settlers built wooden halls and attempted to establish a foothold, but contact with the indigenous people, whom they called Skraelings, was marked by conflict and misunderstanding. Within a few years, the settlers abandoned the site. The memory of Vinland would fade into legend, its reality dismissed until the 1960s, when archaeologists uncovered ruins at Lanzo Meadows, evidence that Norsemen had indeed touched American soil nearly 500 years before Columbus. But their voyages remained isolated, without lasting consequence for the world beyond. That would change in the Iberian drive for empire. By the late 1400s, the Mediterranean was no longer enough. Spain and Portugal, newly unified and increasingly powerful, looked toward the Atlantic. They sought sea routes to Asia, bypassing the overland networks controlled by Islamic empires and Venetian merchants. Portugal charted a path around Africa. Spain looked west. A Genoese navigator named Christopher Columbus approached several royal courts with a bold plan to reach the riches of the East by sailing west across the ocean. After years of rejection, Queen Isabella of Spain agreed to fund the voyage. Columbus set sail from Palos de la Frontera with 3 ships, the Niña, the Pinta, and the Santa Maria. After more than 2 months at sea, on October 12 land was sighted. Columbus had not reached Asia. He had landed in the Bahamas. Unaware of the true geography, he named the island San Salvador, believing he was near the Indies. In the months that followed, he explored Cuba and Hispaniola, met native peoples and founded the first European settlement in the Americas, La Navidad. But his arrival was no mere exploration. It marked the beginning of an irreversible transformation. The encounter begins. The Caribbean became the stage for the first prolonged contact between Europeans and indigenous people. Columbus returned to Spain with stories of wealth and strange peoples, sparking a race for exploration and conquest. He would make 3 more voyages to the New World, discovering more islands and mainland shores. He also brought missionaries, settlers and soldiers. Alongside them came smallpox, measles and other illnesses to which native populations had no immunity. Entire communities were devastated. The Spanish crown moved swiftly to consolidate its claims. Other powers watched with growing interest and alarm. To prevent conflict between Portugal and Spain, the Treaty of Tordesillas was signed in the Pope, acting as arbitrator, drew a line through the Atlantic. Lands west of it belonged to Spain, those to the east, to Portugal. Though the line was invisible, its implications were real. Portugal would eventually lay claim to Brazil. Spain would dominate the rest of South and Central America, and push northward into the future United States. The age of the conquistadors. With the Caribbean as a base, Spain sent conquistadors, military adventurers into the mainland in search of wealth. Some sought fame, others, salvation. Most sought gold. In 1519, Hernán Cortés led an expedition from Cuba to the Mexican mainland. There he encountered the mighty Aztec Empire, ruled by Montezuma II. Through a mix of diplomacy, deception, and military force, alongside native allies who opposed Aztec rule, Cortés marched on the capital, Tenochtitlan. In 1521, after brutal fighting and the spread of smallpox, the Aztec Empire fell. Just a decade later, Francisco Pizarro would do the same in the Andes. In 1532, he captured the Inca ruler Atahualpa and demanded ransom in gold. Despite the payment, Atahualpa was executed. The Inca Empire, weakened by civil war and disease, collapsed soon after. From these victories, Spain carved out a vast colonial empire, stretching from California to Argentina. They brought with them a rigid hierarchy, the encomienda system of forced labor, and the Catholic faith. Missionaries built churches beside native temples. Spanish governors oversaw cities that had once belonged to empires of stone and sun. The Americas were being remade by fire and by crop. Portugal's claim, the birth of Brazil. To the east in 1500, the Portuguese explorer Pedro Álvares Cabral accidentally discovered the coast of South America. He named the land Terra de Vera Cruz, the land of the true cross. It would soon be called Brazil after the red dye of the Brazil wood tree. Portugal's colony followed a different pattern. Rather than mining empires, Brazil became a plantation economy. Sugar became its backbone, and to supply labor, Portuguese settlers turned to the transatlantic slave trade. Millions of Africans would be brought to the New World, beginning one of the darkest chapters in human history. New World's old patterns. By the early 16th century, the world had changed. Maps were redrawn, oceans were crossed, civilizations had fallen, and in their place, new societies began to emerge, hybrids of European, Indigenous and African traditions. But these first decades were only the beginning. As the Spanish solidified their power, other European nations, France, England and the Netherlands, watched from the sideline. Their time had not yet come. But it would. The age of discovery was ending. The age of colonization was beginning. But further north, the landscape remained untouched by lasting European settlement. This would soon change. From the icy banks of Newfoundland to the lush interior of the Mississippi River Valley, a new phase of exploration began, this time led by France, England and the Netherlands. Each sought opportunity, profit, and power, but these ambitions would bring them into competition with each other, and with the indigenous peoples whose lands they now enter. France looks west. France's first serious attempts to reach the Americas began under the reign of King Francis I, who saw with envy the riches flowing into Spain. In 1534, the king sent Jacques Cartier, a skilled navigator, on a voyage across the Atlantic. Cartier sailed up the Gulf of St. Lawrence, claiming the region for France. He met the Iroquoian peoples who lived along the river, trading small goods and establishing diplomatic ties. On a later voyage, he reached as far inland as modern-day Montreal and left behind settlers to found a small colony, but it failed. Harsh winters and poor planning doomed the settlement, and France's colonial ambitions paused for several decades. It was not until the early 17th century that French interest in North America was revived, this time with more methodical planning. Samuel de Champlain, and the founding of New France. In 1608, the experienced soldier and explorer Samuel de Champlain founded Quebec, a settlement perched above the St. Lawrence River. It would become the beating heart of New France. Champlain formed alliances with local tribes, including the Huron and Algonquin, who introduced the French to the fur trade, a business that would define the colony's economy for over a century. Beaver pelts were prized in Europe for hat making, and this trade network reached deep into the continent's interior. Unlike the Spanish colonies, New France did not rely on conquest. The French often depended on peaceful cooperation with native peoples to survive and trade. Though their presence spread slowly, the influence of their settlements extended far, stretching through the Great Lakes and down the Mississippi River Valley. France moved south, Louisiana and the Gulf. By the late 17th century, France turned its eyes southward. In 1682, explorer René Robert Cavelier, Sieur de la Salle, descended the Mississippi River to its mouth. He claimed the entire valley in the name of King Louis XIV, calling it Louisiana. In 1718, the French founded New Orleans, a strategic port and administrative hub. Its location between the Gulf of Mexico and the interior river systems allowed France to control trade throughout the region. Here too, the French adopted a policy of cooperation and intermarriage with native people. The result was a distinct Creole culture blending French, African, and indigenous traditions into a new identity. But as France built its empire, it faced two rising threats: the English on the eastern seaboard, and the Dutch, who had planted a flag on a small island at the mouth of the Hudson River. The Dutch in the New World, New Netherland. In 1609, the Dutch East India Company sent English explorer Henry Hudson west in search of a northern passage to Asia. Instead, he found a deep river that now bears his name. His voyage opened the door for New Netherland, a Dutch colony centered around the trading port of New Amsterdam, on the island of Manhattan. The Dutch focused on commerce, particularly the fur trade. Their settlements were small, their presence light, but New Amsterdam thrived, becoming a bustling port that attracted settlers from across Europe. Still, the Dutch faced a problem: they lacked population. Their homeland was prosperous, and few were willing to risk the hardships of the New World. Without military strength or strong migration, New Netherland would remain vulnerable, and in 1664 the English took advantage. The rise of England's colonial ambitions. While Spain, France, and Portugal had carved out empires, England remained cautious. Internal conflicts such as the Wars of the Roses and the Reformation had consumed its energy. But under Queen Elizabeth I, things began to change. English privateers raided Spanish ships, explorers mapped distant coastlines, and settlers looked to the Americas for opportunity. The first English attempt at a permanent colony was Roanoke, founded in 1585 on the coast of what is now North Carolina. But it vanished without a trace, leaving behind only a single word carved into a tree: Croatoan. Then in 1607, a more lasting settlement was born: Jamestown, the first English foothold. On the banks of the James River in Virginia, a group of English settlers founded Jamestown, named in honor of King James I. The early years were marked by suffering. Disease, starvation, and conflict with the Powhatan Confederacy nearly destroyed the colony. Many of the settlers were unprepared aristocrats and adventurers. Few had farming experience. Supplies from England were erratic. The colony was saved by two developments. First, the leadership of Captain John Smith, who imposed discipline and negotiated with local tribes. Second, the The cultivation of tobacco, a cash crop that transformed Virginia's fortune. Introduced by settler John Rolfe, tobacco quickly became a valuable export, fueling both economic growth and the demand for labor. By the 1620s, tobacco plantations lined the rivers of Virginia, and with them came indentured servants and eventually enslaved Africans, marking the grim beginning of plantation slavery in the English colonies. The northern colonies and the Pilgrim legacy. While Virginia grew through commerce and cash crops, another kind of colony took shape further north. In 1620, a group of religious separatists, known as the Pilgrims, set sail aboard the Mayflower, seeking freedom from persecution. They landed in Massachusetts and founded Plymouth Colony. These settlers brought with them a different vision, not plantations and gold, but community, faith, and permanence. They drafted the Mayflower Compact, an agreement to form a self-governing society under English law. Despite a harsh first winter, they survived with the help of local tribes, including the Wampanoag. The first Thanksgiving, held in 1621, marked a brief period of cooperation. Over time, more Puritans arrived. In 1630, Boston was founded, becoming the center of the Massachusetts Bay Colony. New England grew rapidly, anchored by towns, churches, and schools. Unlike the Spanish or French, the English encouraged large-scale migration. Families came in great numbers, settling on cleared land, building permanent towns and establishing local government. And as they expanded, they pushed deeper into native territories, often sparking conflict. A divided approach. 13 colonies take shape. Over the course of the 17th century, the English established 13 colonies along the Atlantic coast, each with distinct economies, cultures, and systems of governance. Maryland was founded as a haven for Catholics. Rhode Island became a refuge for dissenters and religious minorities. Pennsylvania, founded by William Penn, promoted religious freedom and peace with natives. The Carolinas and Georgia were built on plantation agriculture. New York and New Jersey emerged from former Dutch territories, taken by force but integrated into the English system. Though diverse, the colonies shared common traits: a desire for autonomy, elected assemblies, and an English identity. But beneath the surface, tensions brewed with native peoples, rival empires, and even with the mother country across the sea. Native resistance and new realities. As English, French, and Dutch settlements grew, indigenous peoples faced a new reality. Many tribes sought alliances, trading furs, food, and knowledge. Others resisted. One of the most notable uprisings occurred in 1675, led by the Wampanoag chief Metacom, known to the English as King Philip. His war against the New England colonists became one of the bloodiest conflicts in colonial history. Despite early victories, the uprising was crushed. Metacom was killed and many native villages were destroyed. The balance of power in New England had shifted. The old world had come to the new, and it was not leaving. The wars of empire, France and Britain clash for the Americas. By the early 18th century, European colonies in North America were well established. The Spanish ruled vast lands in the south and west, the French controlled the interior riverways and the north, and the English colonies stretched along the Atlantic seaboard. But as populations grew and ambitions widened, so did the boundaries of each empire. These overlapping claims, especially in the fertile lands of the interior, set the stage for a long series of wars. What began as European disputes would now be fought not only across oceans, but across American forests, rivers, and towns. This chapter in colonial history would be defined by a century of warfare, shifting alliances, indigenous resistance, and a final struggle that would determine who would rule North America. King William's War 1689–1697, the first of the great colonial wars, began in 1689, sparked by European rivalries. In Europe it was known as the War of the League of Augsburg, pitting France against a coalition that included England, the Holy Roman Empire, and Spain. In America it became known as King William's War. The conflict centered on the borderlands of New France and New England, especially the area surrounding the Hudson Bay, Maine, and Acadia, modern-day Nova Scotia and New Brunswick. The French allied with Wabanaki Confederacy tribes and conducted brutal raids on English frontier settlements. English militias responded in kind, targeting French forts and villages. The violence was harsh and personal. Small towns were burned, civilians were taken captive. The brutality of this frontier war shocked many, but it established a deadly pattern.
European wars would now be fought in the Americas, using native alliances, militias, and irregular tactics. The war ended in 1697 with the Treaty of Ryswick, restoring the status quo. No territory changed hands, but nothing was truly resolved. Both sides began preparing for the next war. Queen Anne's War 1702-1713. Barely 5 years passed before war returned. In Europe, the death of the Spanish king without an heir led to the War of the Spanish Succession. In America, it was called Queen Anne's War. This time the conflict widened. Fighting broke out across New England, the Carolinas, and the Caribbean. Spain entered on the side of France, opening a southern front in Florida. In the north, English colonists from Massachusetts captured the French fort at Port Royal, gaining control of much of Acadia, but the attempt to seize Quebec failed. In the south, the English from South Carolina raided Spanish Augustine and fought Yamasee and Appalachee tribes allied with Spain. The war ended in 1713 with the Treaty of Utrecht. England gained Nova Scotia, Newfoundland, and the Hudson Bay region. France retained control of the St. Lawrence Valley but had lost its grip on the Atlantic coast. For Britain, the treaty was a major step toward dominance. For France, it was a warning, and for many indigenous peoples, it marked another blow to sovereignty and autonomy. The quiet between the storms. The decades that followed were a tense peace, not a true. In New France, the French focused on building strong alliances with indigenous nations and fortifying their frontier. The colony remained relatively small in population, fewer than 70,000 people by mid-century, but was well organized and tightly connected by rivers and trade. In British America, however, the population exploded. By the 1750s, over 1.5 million people lived in the 13 colonies. Settlers pushed westward, across the Appalachian Mountains, and into disputed territory, particularly the rich and strategic Ohio River Valley. This expansion brought them into direct conflict with French claims, and with indigenous nations who depended on European alliances to protect their lands. One war was already simmering, and another would soon begin. King George's War 1744. In Europe, it was the War of the Austrian Succession. In America, it became King George's War. The most significant battle took place in 1745, when New England colonial forces, supported by the British Navy, launched a bold expedition against the French fortress of Louisbourg on Cape Breton Island. The fortress guarded the entrance to the Gulf of St. Lawrence, and was vital for protecting French shipping. After a grueling siege, the colonists took Louisbourg, an enormous victory. But in the Treaty of Aix-la-Chapelle 1748, the fortress was returned to France in exchange for concessions in Europe. Many New Englanders were furious. They had bled and died for Louisbourg, only to see it handed back. Their anger deepened colonial resentment toward the British government, a sentiment that would grow in the years ahead. Rising tensions in the Ohio Valley. After King George's War, the French began building a string of forts across the Ohio River Valley, including Fort Duquesne, at the intersection of the Allegheny and Monongahela rivers, modern-day Pittsburgh. This alarmed the British, who had granted land in the same region to settlers and companies. The Virginia colony in particular viewed French activity as an act of aggression. In 1754, the governor of Virginia sent a small force to confront the French. It was led by a young militia officer, George Washington, just 22 years old. He engaged a French scouting party near Great Meadows, resulting in bloodshed. But when the French responded in force, Washington's troops were quickly overwhelmed at Fort Necessity. Though a minor skirmish, it marked the beginning of open warfare. The most important and final struggle for control of North America had begun. The French and Indian War begins, 1754-1763. Known in Europe as the 7 Years' War, this conflict would become the first truly global war, fought on 5 continents. But in North America, it was called simply the French and Indian War, named for the alliance between French forces and various indigenous nations. Early in the war, the British suffered a series of humiliating defeats. In 1755, General Edward Braddock led a large British force toward Fort Duquesne. His army was ambushed in the woods and nearly destroyed. Braddock himself was killed. The defeat shook British confidence. The French and their native allies launched raids across the frontier, destroying settlements and causing widespread panic in the English colonies. But the tide began to turn. In 1757, William Pitt, the British Secretary of State, took control of the war effort. He poured money and troops into the colonies and coordinated military campaigns across the globe. British naval power blockaded French ports and cut off supplies. In 1758, British and colonial forces recaptured Louisbourg, this time for good. In 1759, the most decisive battle was fought outside Quebec. The Battle of the Plains of Abraham. British General James Wolfe led an expedition up the St. Lawrence River and besieged the fortress of Quebec. After weeks of stalemate, he discovered a narrow path up the cliffs protecting the city. On the morning of September 13, 1759, British troops scaled the heights and faced the French army on the Plains of Abraham. The battle was swift but deadly. Both Wolfe and the French commander Montcalm were killed, but the British emerged victorious. Quebec fell. By 1760, Montreal surrendered. The war in Canada was over. In the Treaty of Paris 1763, France ceded all of Canada and lands east of the Mississippi to Britain. Spain, which had entered the war late, gave up Florida but received the Louisiana from France as compensation. The French Empire in North America was gone. The shift in power, a new world order. Britain now ruled from the Atlantic Ocean to the Mississippi River. It was the greatest colonial empire the world had ever seen. But victory brought new problems. The war had left Britain deeply in debt, and maintaining a standing army in North America was expensive. To pay for it, Parliament began taxing the colonies, but many colonists who had just fought alongside Britain felt they deserved a voice in how they were governed. Meanwhile, indigenous nations who had allied with France were now left exposed. In 1763, Chief Pontiac led a broad native coalition in a final attempt to resist British domination. His warriors captured several forts and attacked settlements across the frontier. The rebellion was eventually suppressed, but it prompted the British to issue the Royal Proclamation of 1763, forbidding colonial settlement west of the Appalachian Mountains, a move that angered many colonists hungry for land. The seeds of conflict were planted. The French and Indian War had determined who would rule North America, but in doing so it set the stage for the next, even greater conflict, one that would decide who the colonies belonged to.
The birth of a nation, the American Revolution, the Treaty of Paris, signed in 1763, ended nearly a century of warfare between France and Britain in North America. With the defeat of New France, the British Empire emerged as the supreme power on the continent. But peace came at a high cost. The war had drained Britain's treasury. The empire's vast new territories now required defense, administration, and infrastructure. To manage these demands, the British Parliament looked to the colonies, expecting them to help shoulder the burden of empire. But the colonies saw things differently. They had fought and bled in the wars. They had pushed westward, opening new lands and trade routes. Many believed that they had earned the right to expand freely, to grow, and to govern themselves. What followed was a slow and steady unraveling, a sequence of decisions and reactions that brought the colonies and the crown to the edge of rebellion. The Proclamation of 1763, the first blow, came only months after victory. In an effort to stabilize the frontier and avoid further conflicts with indigenous nations, the British government issued the Proclamation of It forbade settlement west of the Appalachian Mountains, reserving those lands for native tribes. To colonial settlers, especially those in Virginia and Pennsylvania, this was seen as betrayal. They had fought to secure that land. Now they were told they could not claim it. Frustration deepened when British troops were stationed in the colonies to enforce the boundary. Over 10,000 soldiers remained on American soil, not to defend the colonists, but to monitor them, and the colonists would be expected to pay for their upkeep. The Sugar Act and the Stamp Act. In 1764, Parliament passed the Sugar Act, which placed taxes on molasses, wine, and other goods imported into the colonies. At the same time, stricter enforcement cracked down on smuggling and evasion. The following year, in 1765, came the Stamp Act, a direct tax on printed materials including newspapers, contracts, legal documents, and even playing cards. For many colonists, the issue was not the cost, it was the principle. They had no elected representatives in Parliament, and yet they were being taxed by it. The slogan spread quickly, No taxation without representation. The backlash was immediate. Protests erupted across the colonies. Merchants organized boycotts of British goods. Colonial newspapers denounced the tax. In Boston, effigies of tax collectors were hanged in the streets. In October 1765, delegates from 9 colonies met in New York City for the Stamp Act Congress, the first organized colonial response to British policy. Under growing pressure, Parliament repealed the Stamp Act but it passed the Declaratory Act, affirming its right to legislate in all cases whatsoever. The crisis had passed, but the rift had widened. The Townshend Acts and the Boston Massacre. In 1767, the British government, now under Charles Townshend, introduced new duties on imports such as glass, paper, paint, and tea. These Townshend Acts reignited colonial anger. Once again, boycotts spread. Once again, resistance grew. To maintain order, British troops were stationed in colonial cities, particularly Boston, where tensions ran high. On the evening of March 5, 1770, a group of British soldiers fired into a crowd of protesting colonists. 5 men were killed, including Crispus Attucks, a sailor of African and native ancestry. The incident became known as the Boston Massacre. Paul Revere's famous engraving depicted the British as cold-blooded murderers. Newspapers across the colonies fanned the flames of outrage. Though most British taxes were repealed soon after, the tax on tea remained, a symbol of Parliament's authority. The Boston Tea Party. In 1773, Parliament passed the Tea Act, which allowed the British East India Company to sell tea directly to the colonies at a reduced rate, but still with a tax. Colonists saw it as a trap. Accepting the cheap tea would mean accepting Parliament's right to tax them. In response, a group of colonists in Boston disguised as Mohawk Indians boarded 3 British ships. The act, later called the Boston Tea Party, was a dramatic rejection of British authority. London's response was swift and unforgiving. The Intolerable Acts. To punish Massachusetts, Parliament passed a series of laws known as the Coercive Acts, called the Intolerable Acts in America. The port of Boston was closed until the tea was paid for. Town meetings were restricted. British soldiers could be housed in colonial homes. Accused officials could be tried in Britain instead of local courts. These laws shocked the other colonies. What happened in Boston could happen anywhere. In September 1774, 56 delegates from 12 colonies met in Philadelphia for the First Continental Congress. They agreed to boycott British goods and petitioned the king for relief. But the time for petitions was coming to an end. Lexington and Concord. By early 1775, the situation was on the brink. British General Thomas Gage, stationed in Boston, received orders to disarm the militias and arrest rebel leaders. On the night of April 18, colonial riders, Paul Revere among them, spread the alarm. At dawn on April 19, British troops reached Lexington, where they encountered a small militia force. A shot was fired, no one knows by whom, but it became known as the shot heard round the world. 8 colonists died at Lexington. The British continued to Concord, but their militia forces were ready. The British were forced into retreat, harassed all the way back to Boston. The war had begun. The Second Continental Congress and the Siege of Boston. In May 1775, colonial delegates reconvened in Philadelphia for the Second Continental Congress. They appointed George Washington as commander of the newly formed Continental Army. Meanwhile, outside Boston, colonial militias surrounded the city. The Battle of Bunker Hill, fought in June, showed that American forces could stand their ground even though they ultimately retreated. They inflicted heavy casualties on the British. Still, the Congress sent the Olive Branch petition to King George III, one last plea for peace. He refused to receive it. Instead, he declared the colonies in open rebellion. The path to independence. Through the winter of 1775, the conflict deepened. American forces invaded Canada, hoping to capture Quebec and encourage Canadian support. The campaign failed, but it marked the first attempt at expanding the Revolution beyond the 13 colonies. In early 1776, a powerful pamphlet changed the course of public opinion. Written by Thomas Paine, Common Sense argued that monarchy was an outdated and unjust system. It called for full independence and the creation of a republic. It sold over 100,000 copies in just a few months, and transformed the political conversation. By summer, the Continental Congress moved toward a formal break. On July 2, 1776, the Congress voted for independence. 2 days later, on July 4, they approved the final text of the Declaration of Independence, authored primarily by Thomas Jefferson, with edits from John Adams and Benjamin Franklin. It proclaimed that all men are created equal, endowed with unalienable rights, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. It declared the colonies to be free and independent states. The American Revolution was no longer a rebellion. It was now a war for nationhood. The British counterattack. The rest of 1776 would be grim for the new nation. The British launched a massive counter-offensive. In August, General William Howe defeated Washington's army at the Battle of Long Island, forcing an American retreat. By December, British forces had captured New York City and Fort Washington. The American cause seemed on the verge of collapse, but on Christmas night, 1776, Washington crossed the Delaware River and launched a surprise attack on Hessian troops at Trenton. Days later, he struck again at Princeton. The victories were small but vital. They restored morale and kept the revolution alive. A turning point ahead. By 1777, both sides braced for a long war. The British believed that with one major blow they could crush the rebellion. They would try to do so by isolating New England from the rest of the colonies. But the plan would not go as expected, and in the forests of upstate New York, the tide would turn. After 2 years of bloodshed, defeat, and fragile victories, the future of the American Revolution still hung in the balance. The British strategy for 1777 was bold: to divide and conquer. The goal was to cut off New England, the heart of the rebellion, from the other colony. A three-pronged attack was set in motion, but the coordination failed. The Saratoga Campaign and a global war. British General John Burgoyne led his army southward from Canada, intending to rendezvous with General Howe advancing north from New York City. But Howe had diverted to Philadelphia, leaving Burgoyne exposed and isolated. In the thick forests of upstate New York, Burgoyne's progress slowed. American militias cut off his supply lines and blocked his path. On October 1777, after 2 decisive defeats at Freeman's Farm and Bemis Heights, Burgoyne surrendered his entire army at Saratoga. This was not just a battlefield victory, it was a diplomatic turning point. The surrender at Saratoga convinced France that the American cause could succeed. In February 1778, France formally recognized the United States as an independent nation and entered the war as its ally. The American Revolution had become a global conflict. Later that year, Spain joined the war against Britain, and in 1780 the Dutch Republic entered the war as well. The British Empire, once dominant, now faced a coalition of enemies on multiple fronts, across Europe, the Caribbean, Africa, and the seas. Winter at Valley Forge. While diplomacy brought new allies, the American army endured harsh conditions at Valley Forge in the winter of there, under General George Washington, troops suffered from hunger, cold, and disease. But Valley Forge was also a place of transformation. Under the training of Baron von Steuben, a Prussian military officer, the Continental Army was drilled into a more disciplined and effective fighting force. It emerged from winter not only alive but stronger. Shifting fronts, and the war in the South. As the war wore on, the British shifted their focus to the southern colonies, hoping to rally loyalist support. They captured Savannah in 1778, and Charleston in 1780, the largest surrender of American forces in the war. But while the British controlled the cities, the countryside remained hostile. Nathanael Greene, appointed by Washington to command the Southern Army, adopted guerrilla tactics, exhausting the British with swift raids, retreats, and skirmishes. Battles at Cowpens, Kings Mountain, and Guilford Courthouse wore down British forces and sapped their momentum. The war was turning again. The Siege of Yorktown. By 1781, British General Charles Cornwallis moved his forces into Virginia, establishing a base at Yorktown near the Chesapeake Bay.
it would prove to be a fatal miscalculation. American forces under Washington and French troops under General Rochambeau marched south, while the French fleet under Admiral de Grasse blocked British naval reinforcements from the sea. On September 28, 1781, the siege of Yorktown began. After weeks of bombardment, Cornwallis surrendered his entire army on October 9. It was the final major battle of the war. Peace and independence. Though scattered fighting continued, Yorktown broke Britain's will to continue. Peace negotiations began in Paris, and on September 3, 1783, the Treaty of Paris was signed. Britain recognized the independence of the United States of America. The new nation stretched from the Atlantic Ocean to the Mississippi River, and from Canada to Spanish Florida. But as one era began, another ended. The native struggle and broken promises. Left out of the Treaty of Paris were the indigenous nations who had also fought in the war, some alongside the British, some with the Americans. Their lands were now subject to U.S. expansion. Tribes like the Oneida, Tuscarora, and Lenape, who had supported the American cause, found themselves displaced or ignored. Those who had sided with the British faced harsh retribution. As the new republic looked westward, it carried with it the same pattern of colonization, displacement, conquest, and broken treaties. The frontier would not rest. The Articles of Confederation and a nation in crisis. Following independence, the 13 states were united under the Articles of Confederation, ratified in 1781, but the system was weak. The central government had no power to tax, no authority to enforce laws, and no way to regulate trade. The states remained largely autonomous. Economic turmoil, foreign threats, and internal unrest, such as Shays' Rebellion in 1786, revealed the limitations of the Confederation. The young nation needed a stronger foundation. The Constitutional Convention, in 1787, delegates from the states met in Philadelphia to draft a new constitution. It was a moment of extraordinary debate, compromise, and vision. Out of these meetings came a system of checks and balances, federalism, and a division of powers between the executive, legislative, and judicial branches. The Great Compromise created a two-house legislature, the Senate, with equal representation for each state, and the House of Representatives, based on population. In 1789, the U.S. Constitution came into effect. In 1791, the first 10 amendments, known as the Bill of Rights, were added, guaranteeing freedom of speech, religion, assembly, and more. A republic had been born. The end of an era. By the end of the 18th century, the Americas had been transformed. What began in 1492 as the search for new trade routes had become the vast reshaping of continents. Over 3 centuries, the lands of the Western Hemisphere had been explored, conquered, and colonized by European empires. Spain, Portugal, France, the Netherlands, and Britain. Great civilizations, the Aztec, Inca, Maya, and countless others, were lost or absorbed. Indigenous peoples endured war, disease, displacement, and enslavement. The Atlantic slave trade tore millions from Africa and brought them to the Americas in chains. Empires rose, borders shifted, new nations emerged. The formation of the United States was not the end, but a beginning. The 19th century would bring revolutions in Haiti, Mexico, and South America. The European colonial presence in the Americas would slowly unravel, but the legacy of colonization remained. It can be seen in the languages spoken today in Spanish, Portuguese, French, and English. It can be found in the cities built atop ancient homelands. It can be felt in the stories, the cultures, and the unresolved histories of a continent, once home to 1,000 nations. The colonization of the Americas was a story of ambition and brutality, of resistance and survival, of empires and of people who endured. It reshaped the world and continues to shape it still.